course it had an overwhelming effect. Imagine, after the war, I was 15 when I entered the camp, I was 16 when I left it. And all of a sudden you become an orphan. And you have no one. I had that little sister I knew that with my mother the first night, that they were swept away by fire. My older sisters I discovered by accident after the war. In Paris I was in an orphanage. But to be an orphan, you can become an orphan at 50. You are still an orphan. And very often I think of my father and my mother really. At any important moment in my life they are there, thinking, what an injustice now really. Today too, I haven't written much about that period. I've about the 40 books, maybe 4 or 5 deal with that period, because I know that there are no words for it. So all I can try to do is to communicate the incommunicability of the event. And furthermore, I know that even if I found the words, you wouldn't understand. It is not because I cannot explain that you won't understand. It is because you won't understand that I can't explain. I wanted to write, and I wrote my first book, first in Yiddish. In 1956 it came out in Buenos Aires, and then in French in 58, and in New York in 60. I wrote it not for myself really. I wrote it for the other survivors who found it difficult to speak. And I wanted really to tell them, look, you must speak. As poorly as we can express our feelings, our memories, but we must try. We are not guaranteeing success, but we must guarantee effort. I wrote it for them, because the survivors are the kind of most endangered species. Every day there are funerals. And I felt for a while, they were so neglected, so abandoned, almost humiliated by society after the war. When I became chairman of the President's Commission on the Holocaust in 1978, I wanted really to glorify the survivors. There wasn't a committee that I didn't appoint a survivor to the chairmanship of the committee, because I felt they deserve it. Same reason, I wrote it really for that mission. It's always afterwards that in a way your friends or your readers convince you that you went beyond that you are a messenger and so forth. I didn't use those words. I used the word simply, look, we have to tell the story as best as we can, and we know that we won't succeed. I know I won't succeed. I know I haven't succeeded. The word Holocaust, I'm among the first, if not the first, to use it in that context. By accident. I was working on an essay, a biblical commentary, and I wrote about the sacrifice, the binding of Isaac by his father Abraham. And in the Bible there is a word in Hebrew which means olah, which means burnt offering. And I felt that's good. It's Holocaust. It's good because it's fire, and fire and son, meaning the son was almost died, but in our case it was the father who died, not the son. It had so many implications, and that I felt it was good. And then it became accepted, and everybody used it. And then I stopped using it because it was abused. Everything was a Holocaust all of a sudden. I heard myself on television once, a sportscaster speaking of the defeat of a sports team, and he said, "Was that a Holocaust?" My God, really. Everything became a Holocaust. In Bosnia, I remember they spoke about the Holocaust. I went to Bosnia to see, really. I felt, if it is, then I must move heaven and earth. Even if it isn't, I must move heaven and earth to prevent, but at least not to use the word. Well, all this really is not very easy, but why should it be? You can be a silent witness, which means silence itself can become a way of communication. There is so much in silence. There is an archaeology of silence. There is a geography of silence. There is a theology of silence. There is a history of silence. That means silence is universe. And you can work within it and within its own parameter and its own context and make that silence into a testimony. Job was silent after he lost his children and everything, his fortune and his health. Job, for 7 days and 7 nights, he was silent. And his 3 friends who came to visit him were also silent. That must have been a powerful silence, a poignant silence. Well, you see, silence itself can be testimony. And I was waiting for 10 years, really. But it wasn't the intention. My intention simply was to be sure that the words I would use are the proper words. I was afraid of language. Oh, I knew 10 years later I would do something. I had to tell the story. I met a French author, a very great Catholic writer, a Nobel Prize winner, member of the Academy, an old man. And I was a young journalist in Paris then. And we met and we had a painful discussion. I wanted to meet the Prime Minister of France for my paper. He was then a Jew called Mendes France, the legend of France. But he didn't want to deceive me. And one day I decided Mauriac was his guru. Mauriac was his teacher. So I would go to Mauriac, the writer, and ask him to introduce me to Mendes France. When I came to Mauriac, he accepted to see me. The problem was that he was in love with Jesus. He was the most decent, really, person I ever met in that field, as a writer, as a Catholic writer, honest, sense of integrity. And he was in love with Jesus. He spoke only of Jesus. Whatever I would ask, Jesus. Finally, I said, about Mendes France. He said, Mendes France, like Jesus, was suffering. That's not what I wanted to hear. I wanted at one point to speak about Mendes France, and I would say, Mr. Mauriac, can you introduce me? But when he said Jesus again, I couldn't take it. And for the only time in my life, I was discourteous, which I regret to this day. I said, Mr. Mauriac, or we call him Maître, 10 years ago or so, I have seen children, hundreds of Jewish children, who suffered more than Jesus did on his cross. And we do not speak about it. And I felt all of a sudden so embarrassed. I closed my notebook and went to the elevator. He ran after me. He pulled me back. He sat down in his chair, and I in mine. And he began weeping. I've rarely seen an old man weep like that. And I felt such an idiot. I felt like a criminal. Because this man didn't deserve that. He was really a pure man, member of the resistance. I didn't know what to do. We stayed there like that, he weeping and I closed in my own remorse. And then at the end, without saying anything, he simply said, maybe you should talk about it. He took me to the elevator, embraced me. And that year was the 10th year, I began writing my narrative. And when I translated it from Yiddish into French, I sent it to him. And we were very, very close friends until his death. That made me not publish, but write. In spite of Mauriac, who was the most famous author in Europe, he brought it personally from publisher to publisher. They didn't want it. It was too morbid, they said. Nobody wants to hear these stories. Finally, a small publisher, who, by the way, was also Beckett's publisher, which means he had courage, and we published it. So we brought it to an American publisher. It went from publisher to publisher to publisher. All of them refused it. They gave the same reasons. Until a small publisher picked it up. And from 60 to 63, 3 years, it didn't sell 1,500 copies. Nobody wanted to read it. Doesn't matter. I'm not here to sell, I'm here to write. Well, my childhood really was a childhood blessed with love and hope and faith and prayer. I come from a very religious home. And in my little town, I was not the only one who prayed and was loved. There were people who were poorer than us. And not yet in my town, we were considered to be not a wealthy family, but well-to-do, which means we weren't hungry. There were people who were. I spent most of my time talking to God more than to people. He was my partner, my friend, my teacher, my king, my sovereign, and I was so crazily religious that nothing else mattered. Oh, from time to time we had anti-Semitic outbursts. Twice a year, Christmas and Easter, we were afraid to go out because those nights we used to be beaten up by hoodlums. It didn't matter that much. In a way, I was almost used to that. I thought it's part of nature. It's cold in the winter, it's hot in the summer, and Easter and Christmas you are being beaten up by a few anti-Semitic hoodlums. And now it is still the child in me that asks the questions. It is still the child in me that I'm trying to entertain or enrich with my stories, which are his stories. Well, naturally, my grandfather, he was a Chassid, meaning a member of the Hasidic community, and I loved him, I adored him. So thanks to him, I became a Chassid too, and my mother, who actually continued his tradition, she's the one who brought me to Hasidic masters. And all the stories I tell now, I've written so many books about Hasidic tales. These are not mine, these are theirs, my mother's and my grandfather's. My father taught me how to reason, how to enrich my mind. My soul belonged to my grandfather and my mother. And they enriched me, of course. They influenced me profoundly to this day. When I write, I have the feeling, literally, physically, that one of them is behind my back, looking over my shoulder and reading what I'm writing. And I'm terribly afraid of their judgment. After the war, I wrote about it in my autobiography, so I won't come back to that subject. I had teachers, one in France, who was totally crazy. He spoke 30 languages, literally 30 languages. One day he learned that I knew Hungarian and he didn't. So he felt so bad that he learned Hungarian in 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks he knew more about Hungarian literature than I did. And then I had in New York a very great teacher, a very great master. His name was Shaul Lieberman, a Talmudic scholar. And I studied Talmud all my life. I still do, even now, every day. For 17 years we were friends, as only a real teacher and a good student can be. Religious books, of course. At home we didn't study the prophets that much. We studied the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, and then again Talmud. And Hasidic stories. They of course had a lasting influence on me. Secular literature, we had to go to school, so we went to school too. But the main impact I received from my religious schools as a child. After the war, I began reading, of course. I went to the Sorbonne, I began reading literature. It was still Dostoevsky and Thomas Mann, the usual Kafka. I remember the awakening that occurred in me when I read for the first time Franz Kafka. Literally, I remember it. I remember it was in the evening, I began reading it, and spent the entire night reading. And in the morning, I heard the garbage collector around 5 o'clock. Usually, I was annoyed at the garbage collector. It's a very ugly noise that they make, ugly sounds. That morning, I was happy. I wanted to run out and embrace them, all these garbage collectors, because they taught me that there was another world than the world of Kafka, which is absurd and desperate and despairing. I read a lot. I teach my students not creative writing, but creative reading. And it is still from my childhood. You take a text and you explore it, you enter it with all your heart and all your mind, and then you find clues that were left for you, really, destined to be received by you from centuries ago. Generation after generation, there were people who left clues, and you are there to collect them. And at one point, when you understand something that you hadn't understood before, that is a reward. And as a teacher, I do the same thing. When I realize a student there in the corner understands, there's a flicker in the eye, that is the greatest award that a teacher can receive. I have written 40 books, doesn't mean I'm a writer. Well, which means when you have to write profession, I'm not going to write writer after all, profession, writer. Profession is to be a human being, maybe. That's a very noble profession. Or teacher, the noblest of all professions. I write. As a child, really, at age 10, 11, 12, I was writing already. And I wanted to become a writer. And I even wrote a book of commentaries on the Bible. It's so bad. I found it after the war. It's so horrible. I'm embarrassed even to admit that I had written it. My ambition really was, even as a child, to be a writer, meaning a commentator and a teacher, but a teacher of Talmud. And here I am. I'm a writer, for want of a better word, and I'm a teacher. I don't teach the same things. I don't write about the same things, although I do write commentaries on the Bible and on the prophets and the Talmud and Hasidic masters. But I'm a writer and a teacher. In truth, I have learned something. The enemy wanted to be the one who speaks. And I felt, I still feel, we must see to it that the victim should be the one who speaks and be heard. And therefore, all my adult life, since I began my life as an author or as a teacher, I always try to listen to the victim. In other words, if I remain silent, I may help my own soul, but because I do not help other people, I poison my soul. Silence never helps the victim. It only helps the victimizer. Faith, I think of the killer and I lose all faith. But then I think of the victim and I'm inundated with compassion. Be sensitive. In every way possible, about everything in life, be sensitive. Insensitivity brings indifference, and nothing is worse than indifference. Indifference makes the person dead before the person dies. Indifference means that there is a kind of apathy that sets in, and you no longer appreciate beauty, friendship, goodness, or anything. So therefore, do not be sensitive. I meant do not be insensitive. Be sensitive, only sensitive. And of course it hurts. Sensitivity is painful. So what? Think of those that you have to be sensitive to. Their pain is greater than yours. Sensitivity is inclusive, not exclusive. If you are sensitive, you are sensitive to everything. You cannot say I'm only sensitive to this person, but not to others. But then it's not only counterproductive, it's self-defeating. And not only because of religion or because of social problems or medical problems. You must be sensitive. There is nothing more exciting for a person than to be a sensitive person, because then you listen, and you go out and you hear the birds chirping, and it's great. And you see a person in the street, you don't know his face, and you think, well, who knows what secrets that person carries? Which means you learn and you learn and you learn and you become enriched to a point that afterwards it overflows. I would say, favor the question. Always question. do not accept answers as definitive. Answers change. Questions don't. Always question those who are certain of what they are saying. Always favor the person who is tolerant enough to understand that there are no absolute answers, but there are absolute questions. I wouldn't recommend mine because it would be vanity. Were I to recommend others, those whom I'm not recommending would be angry. I would certainly say read classics. I like to reread classics. I mean, the Bible, naturally. Then religious texts, the Hindu texts, the Upanishads and the Vedas are great books. And then go to the Greeks or even in antiquity, the Song of Gilgamesh. These are extraordinary books, even to this day. Read and read and read, but mainly read those who survived the centuries. Equality in diversity. That no group should be superior in the American society than another. Second, generosity. The person who is fortunate, thanks to his or her talent or heritage, to have more than others, that person should know that he or she owes something to others who are less fortunate. Third, that every minute can be the beginning or the end of an adventure. Fanaticism. If there is one word that comprises all of these threats, it's fanaticism. For some strange reason, it is growing everywhere, in every religion, in Islam, in Christianity, in Judaism. Why now? Haven't we seen really that fanaticism is dangerous as an idea, because it carries poison? And furthermore, in politics, imagine a fanatic with power. May I go one step further? Imagine a fanatic with nuclear power. Do you have any doubt that if Idi Amin in Uganda 20 years ago, before he was thrown out, that he wouldn't have used a weapon if he had one? Or a Gaddafi now in Libya? It's dangerous. And a fanatic, therefore, must be unmasked first and then disarmed. I may seem silly or childish to you. If I could bring back one child, I would give up anything I have. Just one child. If I could now, which is more possible, to take out one prisoner, I would give a lot. If I could give a feeling of solidarity to a person who is abandoned, I would still give a lot. So you see, I would like to do things that I cannot do. All I have is a few words, and I will give these words. But that's what I'm trying to do. In spite of what I have seen in my life and observed and endured, I agree with Albert Camus, whom I always love to read and teach. At the end of his novel The Plague, which is a desperate and despairing novel, he says, more or less, he said, there is more to celebrate than to denigrate in man.